Hi, everyone. I'm Rosemary Curley, and I'm here to introduce you to the mammals of Prince Edward Island and adjacent marine waters. We've written a book about them. Myself, Pierre-Yves Daoust, Donald McAlpine, Kimberly Riehl, and Dan McAskill. I'd like to thank Island Studies Press for making this a reality. This publishing house is located at UPEI and is doing a great job. Want to thank our supporters, the PEI Museum and Heritage Foundation, Prince Edward Island Forest, Fish and Wildlife Division, the Wildlife Conservation Fund, Nature PEI, and Purity Dairy. Without them, this book wouldn't have happened. But why write the book? Well, a basic lack of information compelled us to put fingers to the typewriter. And in other provinces, they do have some books. The Land Mammals of Newfoundland, 1974. The Land Mammals of New Brunswick by Tim Dilworth, 1983. In 2004, Nova Scotia released an annotated list of the mammals of Nova Scotia. So at least they have a list, whereas we didn't have much of a list. And thankfully, in 2007, Doug Sobey released an analysis of the historical records for the native mammals in PEI, and that is a great resource. As well, in 2010, the Atlantic Maritime Ecozone book released, there was a chapter on the mammals in that book, and that was very valuable as well, but nothing necessarily very specific to PEI. The Mammals of the Islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence is the book we were relying on. And in fact, we relied on just a chapter in this publication, which was written in 1958 and was decidedly out of date. Still a very respected publication. Now, why include the marine mammals? We also, we felt that being surrounded by water and that there was a lot of marine mammals out there, more than we ever realized, that it would be good to shed some light on them. As well, there's a lot of research has taken place since 1958. Parks Canada has been especially good at sponsoring research in the park and adjacent areas. And UPEI and other universities have taken advantage of that. St. Mary's, Dal, Acadia, and probably others as well. The Atlantic Veterinary College and the has been a boon with parasitologists and such that are studying PEI mammals, and the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative specializes in disease and parasites of animals. The Atlantic Canada Conservation Data maintains lists and status information on our mammals and across jurisdictions. And there's also now a body of information at the Forest, Fish and Wildlife Division, which was founded in 1965. So quite a few files available there, and I had access to them. There's also electronic museum records of where our mammal specimens are stored across Canada, some and United States and the world. Some as far away as University of Georgia, and little to none on PEI, unfortunately. So more is known now, and we also have a changing fauna. New things are arriving. So I'm going to go through the mammals in their scientific order of taxonomy and basically go through the family. So I'm going to start with the rodents and the family of squirrels, Sciuridae. And there are 3 native squirrels. The northern flying squirrel is a nocturnal animal that most people on PEI have not seen. Occasionally it shows up in bird feeders and sleeps there during the day after feeding at night. The eastern chipmunk is familiar to many, and the red squirrel is probably our most common squirrel. In our pictures here, we have a tail with white tips. In Fortune, a blonde red squirrel from Indian River, and a melanistic red squirrel from Roseneath. The beaver is the next one in our list of mammals, but I'm going to talk more about it later. So we'll move on now to the murids, which are the rats, mice, voles, and lemmings. There are lemmings on the mainland, and it's possible that there is a bog lemming here, but no one has yet found it. And perhaps the effort to look for it has not been terribly intensive. But we do have the voles, the meadow vole, top left, a very fat specimen that's living off birdseed, and the southern redback vole, which is a common woodland vole. The meadow vole is also known as the meadow mouse or the field mouse, and I think many are familiar with it, whereas probably most have not seen the redback vole or recognized it as such. The house mouse is an introduced species. The muskrat is a monster mouse, and of course it's found in most of our ponds and sometimes in the coastal salt marshes. The deer mouse, bottom left, is the very most attractive mouse with big ears, big eyes, and it is a climber. And the brown rat, not shown here, is an introduced species, also known as the Norway rat. The name has been changed to confuse us. And the jumping mice are ones that most people have not seen. These are, some people call them kangaroo mice, and they do have big hindquarters. They can jump quite far. And but they are hibernators. They actually spend about 8 months of the year underground, and this is why we're less familiar with them. The snowshoe hare is familiar, I think, to most people, but on the island, it's known more as a rabbit. Now, rabbits are actually different from hares, so hare is the correct way to call it, but I think most of us are content to call it rabbits. It is also known as the varying hare because it changes its color. So in the summer, it is brown, and in the winter, it turns white. There is concern that hares are being affected by climate change. In the States, they've actually measured the retreat of these hares to the north. So what's happening is the hares at the southern edge of the range are not surviving very well as they transition from brown to white in warmer climates. And it would be a shame if our hares disappear because most of our predators are relying on them. I'll move now to the shrews, and the largest shrew is the northern short-tailed shrew. It has a very velvety fur, and it also has a short tail, which helps to identify it. Most of the shrews look like the ones in the tray below. They have a very pointed snout and a short to medium-sized tail. The shrew on PEI is usually referred to as a mole, but moles are actually a different species entirely. The star-nosed mole lives in southern Nova Scotia, for instance. The other shrews that we have here are the cinereous shrew, which means gray, and it is the most common. As well, we have the North American pygmy shrew, which is the animals pictured in the tray below. And these specimens in the tray are from 1897, and they were caught in Alberton, PEI. They're stored in the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. A friend of mine, Barbara McDonald, took the pictures, and she was going to Chicago. She told me that she was going to visit the Field Museum, and so I asked her if and arranged for the specimens to be shown to her so she could photograph them. So that was great. The smoky shrew is a shrew that is common on the mainland, and there have been some records on PEI. The original record by Cameron in 1958 was later said to be a cinereous shrew by the next curator of mammals at the Museum of Nature in Ottawa. So it was misidentified. And for the other remaining shrews that have been found here and said to be smoky shrews, we don't actually have a picture of them or a specimen. So there is some doubt as to exactly whether they're here or not. I hope they're here. In 1980, we learned that the water shrew had been found on PEI. It was actually found in the late 60s by Randy Dibley. And he found them in a muskrat house. And the actual name of the shrew now has changed because genetic information by Hope et al. 2014 indicated that it was actually different from the water shrew in Western Canada and another shrew in British Columbia, Sorax navigator. The name now is Eastern water shrew. The Latin name indicates that it has the white beard. So here we have the white beard. And but even though the Latin name says it's white bearded, we're stuck with the common name, Eastern water shrew. The picture on the top shows the shrew young that were found on a mud flat at Whitlock's Pond, down near Dundas. And the one in the bottom, I think, was taken up in West Cape of the adult. Moving now to the bats, which intrigue people because of their nighttime habits, stories of vampire bats and bats getting in your hair. The woman in the picture here, Lynn Burns, studied on PEI and studied our bats. And as she wrote, well, bats will come around your head if there's a lot of insects there. So take it there. The bat in the picture is the little brown myotis, formerly called the little brown bat. But we also have the northern myotis, which was only discovered on PEI in 1988. They were hibernating in a basement down in Culloden in southern Queens County. And so those were the first records. And they've since been found hibernating in old wells. These bats are insectivores. Now, the one I haven't talked about yet is the hoary bat, Lazarius cinereus, which is a tree bat. So these bats are also migratory. So they go south, and then as the spring comes on, they arrive back in Canada, and they roost in trees and have their young there. We have quite a few records now of these with bat detectors, and we also have some specimens that were collected before 2000, or a specimen, and they do seem to be fairly common, but we don't really know if they're breeding here. They may be just migrating from further west in the seasons, spring and fall. And there's also the possibility that we have other bats, either the silver-haired bat or the big brown bat, or both, because their echolocation calls cannot be separated. And also we have a site record, not a site record, we have a echolocation record of red bats from St. Chrysostom. Now, the plight of the bats is really disturbing because basically they've been decimated, or even more than decimated. The numbers, for instance, in New Brunswick from 2012 to, or 2011 to 2016, over a 5-year period, over 99% of the bats in hibernating in caves were lost. So just an amazing devastation. The disease, white nose syndrome, is caused by a fungus, Pseudogymnoascus destructans. That used to be Geomyces destructans, much easier to spell, but they changed that. Anyway, this map is from 2019, and it shows the location of a New York cave where the fungus first showed up in 2006. And as you go down the list here, the red instances are from 2018-19. So it's progressed. It made quite a leap across the Western Canada and the US. And in PEI in 2013, we had our first white nose syndrome victims. Bats emerged from wells and possibly houses, because some were actually in the houses when they were detected. And they were predated or died of cold. The disease actually causes the animals to lose their body fat, and then they wake up and go looking for something to eat. Very sad. Moving now to the carnivores, the family Felidae, the cats, and the canids, which are the dogs and the bears. As a comment, the fate of large carnivores is not very good around the world, and they tend to disappear because people don't like them. So in PEI, we did lose our bears within the last 100 years or so. The Canada lynx was the original cat for PEI, and there are some, well, I'm going to talk about it later, about how it was lost. The bobcat is an introduced species. The eastern coyote is an invader species, and the wolf was here originally, but very few records. The red fox, of course, is the very common one that we know about. And here our silver fox is just a color variation of the red fox. So it's not a separate species. They can be red, they can be silver, they can be patch or cross, which is something in between red and silver. The mustelids are the weasel family, and these include the North American river otter and the American marten, which I'll discuss later. And the short-tailed weasel, it's somewhat like the snowshoe hare in that it changes color. So it's brown in the summer, white in the winter, it has the black eyes, and it always has a black tipped tail. The mink is something very common that most people recognize, and it is famous because it can be made into a coat. So anyway, these are all fur bearers that have been trapped for fur over the years. The short-tailed weasel was valued by the Mi'kmaq for their robes, and just like the European kings like to have some weasel as well. The mink, well, let's move, sorry. The Mephididae, this is the skunk family. They used to be included with the weasels, but because of their somewhat different habits, and their different parasites and whatever, they've been put in a different family. And of course, we all know they have a different odor. The raccoons is another introduced species. And in our pictured raccoon here is actually a melanistic, so that its tail, you cannot see the stripes on its tail. Both of these species were brought in for fur farming, the striped skunk around 1912, and they were soon released onto the landscape as fur farmers had to endure the descenting process for the skunks, and that didn't go very well. For whatever reason, also the price of fur was probably not as high as it could have been for skunks. The idea of bringing them in was to have a lesser fur than the silver fox that poor people could afford. The raccoons were brought in around 1915 or 1916, somewhere in that range. Now, it is a surprise that there are some other animals that are not land mammals that are also carnivores. So the walrus is one, which I'll discuss later. And then also we have the seals. There are 6 seals that are in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And when we talk about adjacent marine waters, we're really just talking about the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And there are 4 that occur regularly: the gray seal, hooded seal, harp seal, and harbor seal. On the top here are gray seals, and these are harbor seals on Sable Island. This picture of the gray seal is great because it shows the features that you can use to distinguish. The males and females here are not the same size, whereas in the harbor seal they're fairly similar in size. So the big male gray seals have a kind of a long Roman nose, and when you see them in the water, their heads will look like a horse head, and so that makes it easy to recognize them as well. If you see a congregation of seals and the large males are obvious, then you very likely have gray seals. Sometimes gray seals can be they can be associating with others on hollowed areas, such as the harbor seal. And here's these two both breed around PEI on land or on ice. So the gray seal gets started in January or so, in December. And in January and February, there's still seal pups that may be coming on land in PEI. The harbor seal has its pups in the spring, so it's quite different. If you see a seal with small pups in the summer, it's the harbor seal. The ice-dependent seals are the harp seal and hooded seal. Now we have right now about 7.4 million harp seals in the Northwest Atlantic. So that's off Newfoundland and maybe through the Davis Strait and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. On the other hand, the hooded seals are only about 600,000, and with far less of them in the Gulf, less than 10%. The recent pure ice conditions in the Gulf is affecting the seal productivity because the ice is not strong enough to support some of the baby seals, and so excuse me, we've had high death rates on the young, and as well this year, that's in 2020, we had 21. We had seals coming on land to give birth, and so that meant they're more susceptible to predation. Although coyotes go out on the ice among these seal herds and try to, get maybe dead seals and also the placentas that the females shed on the ice. The hooded seal is not one to get too close to. The males have a nose sac that they blow up. They're quite interesting. None of these seals actually should be approached very closely, as they do have very sharp carnassial teeth and they can be aggressive. Now I'm going to talk about the cervids, the deer, and the term deer has been used historically to refer to any of these species, the moose, the white-tailed deer, and the caribou. So I'm going to talk about the moose here because it's really controversial as to whether they actually were in PEI historically. I don't believe they were. They crossed from Siberia after deglaciation and into Alaska, and then they only arrived in Ontario about 5,000 years ago. And so they likely reached the Maritimes too late to cross our land bridge when it was available. Eventually, our land bridge became flooded over and became the Northumberland Strait. The records for moose are only from the late 1800s. There's none historically before that. And at that time, there was a project to interview some of the oldest people in the province and ask them about wildlife. And they asked them, were the moose here? And they said, well, yes, we found their antlers in the woods. But really, these antlers were more likely to be caribou. And there are records of congregations of antlers, which would be typical of a calving group of caribou. White-tailed deer is a failed introduction, which I'll discuss a bit later, but not in great detail. And the caribou was a native, and again, it's extirpated, which means it's locally extinct. And I'll discuss that later as well. There's none here now. Now, if you're keeping track of our terrestrial mammals, we know that we have 28 natives that we can be sure of. We have those additional 2 of uncertain status, the moose or the smoky shrew, 5 introduced, and 3 adventive or failed introductions. Those are the woodchuck, the gray squirrel, and what else? The deer. Okay, so we're going to take, and we also have extra bats that may be here, but they are not confirmed. So now we're going to take a 5-minute break. So check your time and come back in 5 minutes. Now I'm going to show you some of the whales, dolphins, and porpoises in the Gulf. Now, 23 of our 29 marine mammals in the Gulf are in these categories. The remainder are the seals that we looked at earlier. There are some cetaceans that are common species. There's others that are vagrants, very few records. We have some that are extraliminal records, that is way outside their normal range, and extirpated species. So that means locally extinct, and also species at risk. So there's many ways of looking at these. Our pictures here are the minke whale and the harbor porpoise. These are both common ones. The minke is a 12-meter whale. The harbor porpoise is more like a 2-meter. It's the smallest and found quite frequently in our waters, although I can't say I've seen many of them, but maybe if you're out in a boat all the time, you see them. How do we get to know our cetaceans? Well, most of our knowledge is gained from stranding. So that's looking at dead animals. You know, it's much nicer if you can look at live animals and figure something else. So record keeping of known individuals is another way of doing it. When we look at something like the humpback whale, it has barnacles on it, and vegetation as well on the tails. Sometimes animals are recognized if they have rope burns or propeller cuts, scarring from fighting, that sort of thing. And observations from shore or from sea, from ship, are also important, and also listening with hydrophones. Around PEI, the cause of death is not often detected. So even when you find a dead animal from a stranding, there doesn't seem to be a cause of death that's obvious. And it's the opinion of Pierre-Yves Daoust that some of them are just subject to mishap due to being in shallow waters. And they might normally be in much deeper waters. The picture on the bottom is an ear stone from a whale. And I found that on the shore up by Norway, PEI, near North Cape. The whales are divided into two suborders, the Mysticidæ, or baleen whales, and this picture from Wikipedia shows what the baleen is like. So it's kind of a filtering mechanism for capturing zooplankton and the like small fish. The humpbacks have quite a bit of fish that they consume as well by capturing with the baleen. And then there's the toothed whales, like this beluga, which is an endangered species and lives in the St. Lawrence estuary in this part of the world. It is one of 5 families with 14 species. The fin whale on the left is a special concern species. So this is the extirpated species, the bowhead whale. It's closely related to the right whale, and it was hunted for its oil, primarily for its oil, from about 1530 to for the next 100 years or so in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and in the Davis Strait. Actually, the Strait of Belle Isle off Newfoundland was a big area. The San Juan, a Basque galleon, sank at Red Bay in 1565. There were many groups after the whales, but the Basques were holding sway at that era. And Basque refers to the Bay of Biscay, and so you have French Basques and Spanish Basques. The whole thing, the whole practice at Red Bay was discovered by a Parks Canada researcher, Selma Barkham, and she found the red tiles on the shore that were used as roofing tiles around the Bay of Biscay, and they were used. They used them on the where they built structures for boiling down the whale, and they also had a roof on them. So there were bowhead, there were bone piles along Red Bay and the Quebec North Shore of the Gulf. And then later, Brenna McLeod looked at those and found the genetic markers were really of the bowhead whale and not the right whale. There were some right whales there, but mostly they were over 80% bowheads. So this species really succumbed to the harvesting in the Gulf. The bowhead belongs to the family Bellinidae. So it and the northern right whale are the two members of it. And the right whale here looks very similar to the bowhead that we just looked at. And you can see again its barnacles around its snout and different markings on the belly. The latest estimates for this endangered whale is that there's about 360 left. Now, only a couple of years ago, we thought there was 411 of them left. These whales have succumbed to exploitation for their oil, entanglements now with fishing gear, particularly crab and lobster, where there's a lot of rope out now, especially with the crab. Those are in very deep water, I think, compared to most of the lobster. And there's more entanglements there for some reason. Also collisions with ships. The Gulf of St. Lawrence is extremely busy shipping lanes, and they don't, they go fast. So the recent regulations are that ships must slow down in certain areas so that whales can get out of the way. Otherwise, they get hit and often die. The fin whale is a special concern whale. And it was only in 1986 that a whaling moratorium was put in place in Canada. So up until then, people could still take whales. And these whales, like the fin, 90 to 100 years old, it doesn't reproduce until it's pretty old, and it doesn't have young every year. So it takes a long, long time for these animals to recover. The minke is okay. I overestimated its length before, just more like 9 meters instead of 12. It is one of the most commonly stranded here on PEI. The sei whale is there's one record of a specimen that is buried at Nail Pond. At Nail Pond, there's quite a big whale graveyard there. For some reason, currents seem to deliver the dead whales on that shore. And that is also the shore where the blue whale, which is our biggest whale, was deposited back in 1987. For the humpback whale, there aren't any strandings on PEI. Now, there are occasional sightings, but no, it's not one that has stranded here. It doesn't occur here very often. And here's our picture of the blue whale at Nail Pond. And you can see the, excuse me, cars and trucks for comparison, for scale, and even people. And also, you can tell that a lot of people came in their vehicles and drove on the shore and looked at it. These whales live in the summer. There's a lot of them in this area along the Quebec North Shore. And there's a whaling station, and this is for studying whales as opposed to capturing whales in the Mingan archipelago. So there's quite a bit of information known about them. it's estimated that there's only about 200 left in Canadian waters. And normally they might have to go out to sea in the winter. In just a few years back, sometime in the last 5 years, there was a big body of ice here between Cape Breton and Newfoundland. And I think there were 8 blue whales trapped there and died in the ice. So this is an endangered whale. Now we'll move to the dolphins, family Delphinidae. And you can see here quite a long list of these dolphins, many that don't occur here very regularly. But the ones that do are the long-finned pilot whale. Also, the killer whale, we actually have one stranding from 1968 at Cape Wolf, and this was a small female killer whale. So it is not a whale, it is a dolphin. So just to show you a few of these, this is the short-beaked common dolphin, and it does have a pretty good beak. And it had stranded in Charlottetown in 2007 and at North River as well. The Atlantic white-sided dolphin is much more common. It's the one you're most likely to see. And 45 of those stranded in the Dunk River in September of 1990. You have to be sharp, look to make sure where that yellow patch is, and that will help you identify them. This is the long-finned pilot whale. It is actually a deep water whale, but it does come into the Gulf. The ones that are off Cape Breton on the Atlantic shore have been studied quite a bit by researchers from Dalhousie University, and they find they're very social animals and have a matrilineal society where old grandmother whales that are no longer reproducing are teaching younger whales how to find food and how to act. I don't know all the details of it. The fishermen call these blackfish. So you'll often hear they're blackfish. I think Stan Rogers has that in one of his songs. The striped dolphin is one that just is a southern species. So it's way outside its range here. It is rare on the Scotian shelf and even more so in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But one came ashore in Shediac, New Brunswick in late fall 2017. So that's just across the strait from us, pretty close to home. Then we have the Monodontidae. There are 2 species in the Gulf, the beluga, which is an endangered species that it lives in the St. Lawrence estuary, but we do get strays that come to PEI occasionally, such as one that met with a lot of divers from the Marine School in Summerside just a couple of years ago. The narwhal, or sea unicorn, as they called it back in the day, is very rare, but there have been vagrants in the Gulf. So these are normally in the Arctic, and they can get in quite large schools. And but there's some showed up in the Gulf, 2003 and 2016 to 18, and these associated with the belugas in the estuary of the Gulf of the St. Lawrence River. The harbor porpoise is found in shallow coastal waters up to 200 meters in depth. The Gulf itself is not very deep. The deepest areas are in the St. Lawrence Channel that runs out between Cape Breton and Newfoundland that get maybe 600 to 800 meters. The harbor porpoise has a high metabolism and has to eat constantly. It is susceptible to entanglement in nets, and its abundance now relates to the lack of a net fishery, because its numbers had been quite reduced when there was a cod fishery and a lot of herring fishing going on in the Gulf, and the Southern Gulf especially. And with the closure of the cod fishery, the harbor porpoise has rebounded because there's been less loss due to drowning in nets. Then we come to this sperm whale. I think this is the one from Moby Dick It's a deep water whale. It can dive to 1 to 3 kilometers, and it eats squid and lives in nomadic groups. It is very prone to stranding in our shallow waters. And so we have 16 records of these from 1990 to 2008. Now, when one does strand, usually someone will go with a chainsaw and cut off the lower jaw for the teeth, because they are a valuable trade item. Kind of sad, ruining a good specimen. And anyway, the breeding age is 30 years, and the killer whales will attack the calves. So that's one of the chief causes of mortality, besides this stranding, which seems to be quite a problem. The pygmy sperm, there's only one record of it, and it's from the north shore of the Gulf. And at last we come to the Ziphid beaked whales. The northern bottlenose whale is one that lives in the gully off the Sable Island. It's a deep water channel, and it's home to this endangered whale, which is quite rare in the Gulf. We just have 1 or 2 records of it straying into the Gulf. Usually it stays in that deep water area, where there is some concern that sonar for oil and gas exploration can be causing it problems. The Sowerby's whale, this one in the bottom left picture, was found off North Rustico, on the shore at North Rustico, back in 2013. So that was the first record. And then Claude Bourke and the Magdalen Islands found this Trews whale that came ashore and stranded. I'm pretty sure the skeleton of that one has been prepared. After our book was published in 2019, not very long after, there was a record of a Cuvier's beaked whale being found in the Gulf. So our book is already out of date. Okay, so we're coming to the end of our talk here now, and I want to just talk a bit about influences on mammal diversity. And so these pictures on the left, the maps here, are prepared by John Shaw, who is a paleogeologist, and he's studied all the information on the glaciation. One of the things that I was surprised to learn is that it takes the ice mass was probably about 1 kilometer thick over PEI. So PEI was depressed by the ice, and when it started to melt, then the land rebounded, and a land bridge developed between PEI and the mainland. So life could reinvade PEI from that area. Now, in terms of reinvasion, all the mammals during glaciation were down south. So the caribou were as far south as Louisiana, and then they had to come back north, and well, nobody was forcing them, but they did come back north and reinvaded the areas as the glaciers retreated. So life reinvaded, but then after the rebound, the land sank again, just like a rubber ball would sink back down, and then the land bridge was flooded. So we're now an island, but the thing is, anything that got here before the land bridge flooded over, had easy access to PEI. The mammals that came late, like porcupine and the woodchuck, didn't get here naturally. We also have a limited size. Settlement has definitely influenced diversity, exploitation, and habitat change, and also introductions. So here's our woodchuck, probably got to PEI in 2017 on a pallet of grass from the mainland. We're also a small province. We're at the edge of the range for a lot of things. So the edge of the northern range, or sometimes the edge of the southern range. Our habitat is pretty much homogeneous. We're not interrupted by mountains. We don't have large lakes and so on, or really huge rivers. And most tellingly, we live in the northern hemisphere. Compared to the Amazon, we're pretty short on species. Indigenous peoples didn't have much effect on wildlife. Most mammals are forest mammals, and the settlers cut and burned and converted the habitat to farmland. So that just meant those mammals had way less area to live in, and anything that needed a large area was likely to disappear. So by 1900, we're talking 70% clear, whereas right now we're more like 55% clear. And that makes a big difference, just those few percentage points. Now I wanted to talk a bit about the fur and whale and walrus fisheries, and just because I think most people don't realize that how long this was going on. The bowhead whale was one example. We know that John Cabot was in the area in 1497. Fagundes was a Portuguese guy that explored. He had a grant for the walrus fishery in the Gulf, including the Magdalens, and the Basques and French were already present there. Fagundes was said to have settled in Cape Breton, but nobody has found his settlement. This is the Atlantic right whale. When I went to school, we didn't learn anything about the fur trade on PEI, but there are old records of fur trade. And Nicholas Denny's was one guy who had a grant in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And these kings, they just granted stuff, even though they probably didn't have much right of ownership. And they included PEI in the grant to make a trade with the said Indians. And at that time, Denny said, well, there was 500 French vessels going to the fishery in the Gulf every year. And so they were likely there about 8 months of the year, including their coming and going. Then we have several records of the Mi'kmaq trading with the French, although the 1700s was said to be a poor time for the fur trade. This map on the right is showing the beavers below the Niagara Falls there. They're waiting to get up, just like fish or salmon. Oops, wrong way. The historians have plotted 1490 to 1580 when individual fishermen traded with the Mi'kmaq for fur. And after that, there was a constant demand for beaver fur until about 1840. And it wasn't always associated with the cod fishery. A guy named Etienne Belanger or Stephen Belanger did his own trapping all along the southern Nova Scotia shore in 1583. And he had about 20,000 crowns, French crowns worth of fur. Just a picture of the cod fishing. Nicholas Denny's wrote a fabulous book on that and on the practices of the day. So just to talk about the walrus now, the main herd was situated on Sable Island, but it was also around the Gulf. For instance, Jacques Cartier saw them on the Quebec North Shore of the Gulf. There were many old records from PEI. Sea Cow Head and Sea Cow Pond are named after the walrus, which was known as the sea cow. The French name for it is morse. And our French on PEI participated in the hunt on the Magdalens from 1728 to 1758. They built a boat and went over. Hunting on PEI was described by John Stewart of Mount Stewart in 1806. And basically he said they got between the walrus and the water. These walrus would be lying on shore, and then they poked them with sticks, drove them into the woods, and slaughtered them. The main exploitation was in the 1500s, and by early 1800s, the walrus was forecast to disappear. Now, in the Patterson licensed a walrus fishery 1770 to 1775. So this was not to control or not to protect the walrus. It was to decide who got a license and who got the spoils. The main use was for oil and ivory, and the skins and meat were also used by people locally. Genetic evidence is that the maritime walrus was morphologically and genetically distinctive. These things weigh up to 2 tons. That would be the males. And but surprisingly, they live on clams. They can slurp up to 50 clams at a dive. So what they do is they just suck the clam out of its shell. The beaver is probably the first mammal on PEI to become extirpated. They were trapped out before French settlement in the roughly 200 years in which furs were trapped in the Gulf. And that's my theory of extirpation. But there are many old teeth that are testimonials that the beaver were here. And picture these incisor teeth here that are quite easy to identify. There's no first-hand account of the beavers after 1719 until the mid-1800s, when it said that there was a beaver dam on the Dunk River and that the beavers had disappeared after that. Historically, or way back, the beavers were in Cape Breton after glaciation, after the glaciers melted. This is a map of bogs and which ones had beavers. It's quite a study. And anyway, there's a record from Cape Breton 9,500 before present, which is before 1950. And at the time, PEI was connected to the mainland for at least 4,000 years. So there's nothing to keep beavers out of PEI. They're also good swimmers and likely invaded PEI by swimming in recent times, such as the beaver on the Dunk River. The fur trade was the cause of the loss here as elsewhere. I mean, pretty near every jurisdiction in North America was down to very few beavers at one point or another. For caribou, the history here is that there are molars at East Point in an archaeological dig, and similarly a foreleg of a caribou from Robertson's Island in PEI National Park. There's also an 1877 story of hundreds of antlers in Brackley. And this is where I speculate that this was a group of female caribou that gave birth and then dropped their antlers after that, as is typical. And the caribou is one where both the males and females have antlers. There's a recent find of an old antler on the Rustico sand bear. So this is the picture of it here. But we don't really have to rely on those records because we have site records of caribou, like Nicholas Denny's in 1672, who said they were very light in color and that the Mi'kmaq appreciated their food value. And of course, anybody would appreciate their food value when you have a large piece of meat on the hoof. Denny's thought the caribou wouldn't survive very long. And but they were still reported to be present by his nephew, Denis de Laurent, in 1721, and Samuel Holland in 1765 when he was surveying the island. Now, Doug Sobey thinks that maybe Samuel Holland is just reporting what the Acadian settlers had told him, and he might not have seen them himself. In any case, our caribou disappeared very early, and in the rest of the Maritimes, and in Maine, it was much later, Maine 1908, Nova Scotia 1921, New Brunswick 1928. Today, the last remaining woodland caribou are in the Gaspé. And then north of the St. Lawrence, we're into boreal caribou, but they're all actually the same species, but this is considered to be a somewhat different group of caribou. Excuse me. Now, as far as the wolf goes, we're not really sure what kind of wolves were here, but we're fairly certain some wolves were here. In 1721, a wolf pelt was presented at Port La Joye and was to be shipped to France. And that report is by Denis de Laurent. And he said the island wolves are of a prodigious size, but did anyone else mention them? And really, there was no other mention until 1846. And at that time, we have this wolf record, which is reproduced in an 1898 book. But an event of a very different kind occurred in the neighborhood of Tryon River. At this period of our writing, a young man by the name of Thompson was engaged trapping foxes, when one morning, to his surprise, he discovered a very large wolf ensnared in his iron trap, which was instantly killed. Though by what means or why the ferocious animal came to the island remains a mystery. It was supposed, however, that being in search of food, he scented the mail carriers whom he followed from Cape Tormentine to Cape Travers, with the expectation, no doubt, of having a much nearer acquaintance. Here's a wolf that was trapped at Caracat, New Brunswick in 2012. And you'll note it's, well, 39, I'll say 40 kilograms. So it's almost 100 pounds. And it was the first origin, wild origin wolf south of the St. Lawrence in 100 years. So north of the St. Lawrence, there are timber wolves. Ours might have been eastern wolves. They're a smaller wolf that's found in Algonquin Park, for instance. There are Nova Scotia records from European contact until the early 1900s. They were bountied there from 1794 and then off and on until 1867 and even into the 20th century. So that 18 pelts were submitted for bounty in 1921. This is the Caracat wolf here. This is a hybrid of a coyote and a wolf, and this is also a wolf that was in the eastern townships of Quebec, but it's a captive wolf according to the genetic or the analysis of its tissues. It wasn't fed on wild foods. The American marten was a small fur bearer of 2 to 3 pounds, 1 to 3 pounds, and it was noted by Denis de Lerande in 1721. Was used for robes by the Mi'kmaq and eaten by the food-deprived Acadians that had survived the expulsion. They did survive the expulsion, but their crops and so on were not available to them. So there's many records of the marten being here, and that it was harvested for fur. For instance, 6 dozen marten skins found in the Rennie estate. Stewart said that it was abundant in some years, and there's records of pelts being shipped out. These are customs records, so 440 pelts shipped out in 1834. But what happened after that? Human population increased. There was a loss of the forest. And in 1879, the legislators began to be worried about the marten, and so they closed the season for marten harvest between May and November, and also for otters. So up until that time, you could hunt anything at any time of the year. There weren't any regulations. There was no restrictions on when you could take an animal. In 1906, they closed it again, April to November. So they added an extra month of closed season. But this did not stop the disappearance of the marten. It disappeared due to unregulated trapping and forest loss. And in fact, the marten was one of the most easily trapped mammals. So it met this fate over a wide range, not just in PEI, but elsewhere. The lynx also disappeared due to people, disappeared due to people. It was widely recorded on the island, and it was sought for its pelt and was edible. But the early settlers let their sheep and cattle roam in the woods because they didn't have any fields for them. And the mink, or the lynx and the bears ate the sheep and cattle. So they put a bounty on, and Stan Vass did the research on this, and he researched both the bear and the lynx. And but he found that their bounty records were combined, in the evidence, so he made some sort of educated guess as to how many for each animal. And he figured 357 paid out between 1820 and 1861. In 1834, we learned that 40 pelts were shipped to London fur auctions. According to Bain, by 1890, the lynx was unknown in the province. Habitat loss and persecution was the recipe for its demise. Populations as well during a hare low might be at risk. So the hare populations typically go up and down, and then the lynx populations follow the same pattern. So when the hares are low, then the lynx become low shortly afterward, and this would be an easier time to get rid of them through persecution or bounties, whatever. There's a book called The Jolly Wake, and there's a description there of a young fellow who went hunting lynx with his dad up around Foxley River, probably around 1880. And the lynx came in the shed and where the animals were. And so then they pursued it with the dog and treated it in a yellow birch and shot it. That could be one of the last lynx. For the American black bear, there is a small archaeological record, but it wasn't commonly disposed of in the Indian middens. But it was used valued for its bearskin rugs and also as a food item. It was said to be common by many authors, and it was greatly feared. The same situation with the lynx, the livestock stock in the woods tempted the bears, and many bear hunts and encounters have been recorded, especially by Jim Hornby in the Island magazine. He has 2 articles, Bear Facts Part 1, Bear Facts Part 2, and he also documented some deaths. Now, these deaths didn't always have to be outright killing by the bear. They lived in a time where there were no antibiotics, and without that, they could die from injuries. The bounty put on the bear, 1790, 15 shillings a bear, which was said to be really a very high price. By 1820, some authors were saying it was scarce, and Vass estimated 1,000 bounties paid over a 41-year period. Now, bears reproduce slowly. They don't breed every year. They bring their cubs to adulthood, and that takes a while. So this just means that they don't recover from persecution easily. The last bear on PEI was shot in 1927 on the Surrey Line Road by 2 teenagers. Their surname was Leslie. They saw the bear tracks in the woods, went home and got their shotguns, and they only had a few shells each, not very many, but anyway, they succeeded in killing the bear. And that's the last record of a bear that's shot, at least a written record that I saw. For the river otter, there are many records from 1721s onwards. Now, the river otter is the be-all to end-all in fur. It is beautiful and durable, and therefore always in demand. And here we have some records of otters being shipped. Not a lot, because otters use a very large area, so they wouldn't be as dense as a fox population. And here we see 31 otters versus 493 fox pelts being shipped out of PEI. In 1879, the legislature closed the seasons for otter, again, as I mentioned earlier. And but Robert Jenkins, who probably lived in Mount Albion area, he saw otter sign in 1898, and then 2 pelts from Piscott in a Charlottetown store. And he said, well, the otters are now almost extinct. He wrote about this in a magazine called the Prince Edward Island Magazine. The magazine didn't last very long, and neither did the otter. But he also said that otter had wintered at Wisner's Pond in Watervale 35 years earlier. That's a bit south of Fort Augustus. Protection for the otter was stepped up in 1906, but probably the otter was already gone because there aren't any other records until 1951, when the World of the Otter reports that there was a pelt. And in the early 1970s, there was an otter caught in an eel trap at Seal River near Cardigan. But we've had sightings since 2000. And in fact, now we seem to have a breeding population of river otters. And they can swim. They have no trouble swimming across from other provinces. And right now, the price of fur is low, and probably not many are being trapped on the mainland, and there's more of them available to disperse to our area. So just on the invasions, the otter is coming back, and we've also had the coyote arrive under its own steam. It crossed on the ice. I have seen a photograph, I wish I had a copy of it, of the coyote between the two ferries in the Northumberland Strait on the ice pans. So the top picture here looks like a wolf, but it's really a coyote. And here, this is in PEI National Park, a very orange looking coyote. And that seems to be a fairly typical color for the coyote. These animals weigh 14 to 16 kilograms, so way less than the wolf. But you know, they still are a powerful force. They're very intelligent. They try to keep away from people, and but they're also persecuted on PEI. Nevertheless, they have a high rate of reproduction like the fox does, and it will be very hard to ever get rid of coyotes. So we just have to learn to live with them. Now I want to talk about the introductions. And I think I mentioned quite a few of them already, but the raccoon, introduced around 1915. Now this does affect our diversity because it just increases the number of mammals that we have. Likewise with the skunk around 1912. The white-tailed deer was brought in the 1950s. This is a woman called Jean Jones, and she's the daughter-in-law of the Premier, Walter Jones. So the first deer that were brought in were presented to the Premier. And but many deer were actually brought in, according to Dutch Thompson, probably up to 200 or so from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. But these deer were captive fawns, and they really didn't have any mother to help them out, you know, to learn how to behave as a deer. So they're being fed here. They're very habituated to people. And the farmers around Charlottetown didn't particularly like them. So they rounded them up and took some down to Kings County and some up to Prince County. So anyway, it was good for the farmers of Charlottetown, but I expect a lot of them just ended up in somebody's dinner pot. We have the brown rat, an animal we can't get rid of. And the bobcat was brought in here first in the 1970s in the Tignish area, and then in the 1980s, mid-1980s, in the Fort Augustus area. And there have been dead bobcats found occasionally, but I think only 3 that I can think of for sure. People are seeing them, but some trappers wonder, have they really survived? So it's that's a good question. If they're here, you know, they're filling probably the role of the lynx, and they will eat snowshoe hare and mice. They will be much better adapted to warmer climate than the lynx. Our woodchuck was brought in, I mentioned earlier, in 2017, and I only recently found out actually that they had successfully trapped it in 2018, which is before we published our book. So Anyway, too bad that was a secret. The gray squirrel, there's only a single record of it showing up at a woman's bird feeder, and it was never seen again. So probably hopped on a truck that was coming from New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, or further away. And luckily, it hasn't survived here. The house mouse is something that's here to stay. I think, though, that people who live in new houses don't see house mice. I haven't, although I grew up with them in an old farmhouse. Okay, so I think that's it. Thanks for listening. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation.